Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on Russians to protest and fight back against Russian President Vladimir Putin's draft of 300,000 reservists. But as Deborah Patter reports, some of these men don't have a choice.
No time to dodge this bullet. In scenes shown on Russian television, only tearful farewells as civilians called up to fight in Vladimir Putin's war said their goodbyes to loved ones. Those that could try to leave the country to avoid conscription. Traffic backed up at several Russian border exits. Many of these reserve soldiers have never fought in a war, let alone one that has even hardened Russian fighters fleeing positions like this one in Kharkiv. The men of Senior Lieutenant Taras Berezovet's Special Forces Brigade led the charge during Ukraine's offensive here, tricking Russian troops into thinking it would take place in the south of the country. Instead, they hit a Russian base here in northern Nova Husarivka, surprising soldiers playing poker.
This is where Russian troops set up their headquarters. And you can see, look around, they fled in such a hurry, it's like a museum of panic.
Commanders escaped first, abandoning their troops in a nearby trench, where we still found a pot of food and religious icons.
And the Ukrainian forces effectively attacked Russians not from the front. They've been outflanked, and that explains...
And outsmarted?
And outsmarted. They were fleeing from here, just like rats.
This was supposed to be one of Russia's elite units. It collapsed in a matter of hours on the first day of the offensive.
Putin begins referendums in occupied territories as early as tomorrow to push through a vote to become part of Russia, upping the ante even more. Elaine?
Deborah Patta, thank you. For more on this, let's bring in the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. He served in that role under both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama from 2006 to 2009. Ambassador, welcome. We just saw in Deborah's piece how the Kremlin's partial troop mobilization will affect Russian forces in Ukraine. But how might this change the dynamic for Ukrainian forces on the ground?
Elaine, I think the Ukrainian forces are so high, they are so moving forward, they are so elated at their successes that they're going to continue to push no matter what the Russians do. As you just pointed out, as your reporter just pointed out, the Ukrainians conducted a coup. They made a great move in the north. Their generals did a great job of disguising that move. And so the Ukrainian soldiers are now very excited about their ability to fight the Russians. This call-up of reserves that we've been talking about, that President Putin is talking about, it's going to take time. We just saw that many of these people they're calling up now have never served, which means they need to be trained, or they're just going to be sent in to fight these very well-motivated Ukrainian soldiers. So the Ukrainian offensive continues and pushes back the Russians, even while they're trying to find soldiers to put in place of those that have already been killed.
Well, some Russian men who may be drafted to the front lines in Ukraine have fled the country or are trying to. Ambassador, where do you think they're going? What does this tell us about the sentiment regarding the war among Russians?
This tells us that what we had thought President Putin was concerned about, he was concerned about. That is, we thought that he was not announcing a full mobilization, calling up the reserves, because he was worried about a backlash among normal Russians. And sure enough, even this partial mobilization has caused this kind of very strong reaction among Russians across the board. This used to just apply, the soldiers that have been fighting so far have been from far out parts of Russia. And now, with this draft, with this conscription, with this call-up of 300,000 or more, there are going to be people from St. Petersburg, from Moscow. And these people have not been prepared for a war. They've been told, Elaine, it's a special military operation, it's no big deal. It's a war, and now they're having to go, so they're trying to get out of the country. The flights are full. You can't get tickets out of the country now. You asked where they're going. They're going to places where they don't need visas because they're not getting into places in Europe where they need visas. So they're going to places like Tbilisi, Georgia, or Istanbul. And so these are the places where they can flee and try to avoid this call-up.
So against that backdrop, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a veiled nuclear threat to the West, essentially, on Wednesday. Given your expertise in the region as a former ambassador to Ukraine, do you think that Putin is bluffing, or is this a real threat?
Elaine, you have to take it as a real threat. He has done some things that we didn't predict, that we didn't expect. So we have to be alert to any of those kinds of moves that he might make. However, he has said this before. He has said this repeatedly since the beginning of this war. He has said that he's reminded us that he's got nuclear weapons, and he's reminded us that he can use them. So he's used these threats before. So far, he's not made any moves in that direction. Our military and our services have no higher mission than to watch on the Russian nuclear weapons. And so far, we have spotted no movement, no indication that these nuclear weapons are being put into places where they might be used. That could change. So, and again, we have to take it seriously. We have to tell him, and President Biden has done this, we have to tell President Putin the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. He's going to be even more of a pariah than he is now, even among the Chinese and the Indians who have supported him, or at least have not opposed him up until this point. He will lose all support around the world, and he will face consequences, military consequences, if he uses these weapons.
So what do you think about the potential role here for the United Nations? Because on Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called on members of the UN Security Council to tell Russia to stop making nuclear threats and end the war in Ukraine. But how can the UN intervene when Russia's leader won't even participate in the annual General Assembly?
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, whose whole purpose was to do exactly this, prevent wars, stop wars, take collective action to prevent wars. And because the war is being persecuted, being pursued by one man, President Putin, who's on that Security Council with a veto, that Security Council is paralyzed. So it cannot act. Now, that said, there are other parts of the UN, Elaine, that are actually doing some good work. There are humanitarian actions that the UN is taking. There are ways that the UN can do some good work around the outskirts, the periphery, but the main purpose of the United Nations is to prevent war. And President Putin is stopping that, is putting a roadblock into that purpose.
Perilous times. Ambassador William Taylor, Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Elaine.